Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right of Resistance. I'm your host, Kuros Charney. My guest today is Dr. Maura Finkelstein. You know her as a writer, anthropologist, ethnographer, and longtime advocate for Palestinian liberation. Last year, she became the first tenured professor since October 7th to be fired for a pro-Palestine speech. But that has not diminished her commitment to the Palestinian cause, which she continues to support through her writing and activism. Maura Finkelstein, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
So, since you're firing from Muhlenberg College, you've been writing a lot about Palestine and Zionism. You yourself are Jewish and anti-Zionist. Before we get specifically into your writing, could you briefly walk us through what happened at Muhlenberg? Because I think it illustrates many people's interpretation of what Zionism is, the definition of which I think is essential to our discussion. So,
yeah, thanks for that question. So it's so funny. As time goes on, I change the way I tell the story, obviously. But I think that there's a few things that have become really critical about my case that I think we need to talk a lot about. So like a lot of people, I taught about Palestine, I wrote about Palestine, and I was often on social media posting about Palestine before October 7th, before Al-Aqsa flood, and had been on the radar of organizations like Hillel International, especially the Hillel chapter in my college. But, while we were seeing, for the past few decades, the surveillance, repression, and sometimes firing, dismissal, blacklisting of Palestinian Arab Muslim faculty members and a few Jewish faculty members. We have to include my not uncle Norman Finkelstein in the mix, for no relation, except in my heart. For the most part, for, over a decade, I felt somewhat protected by my own identity, that I used it as a shield to sort of justify the work that I was doing, or provide cover for the work that I was doing. I can't be accused of anti-Semitism because I'm Jewish and, Zionism is not Judaism, et cetera, et cetera. My way of speaking about this now has changed, but around the time of October 7th, that was definitely the place that I was in, where I felt still pretty protected by my own identity, for better and for worse. But I think what we've seen is that October 7th, 2023 provided this really pivotal moment for the far right and Zionists who have been doing organizing for decades and decades to chill pro-Palestine speech on campus, to center Israel in all conversations, to equate Zionism with anti-Semitism. And this has been successful in various different ways, but never to the extent that we're seeing right now. So I would say as early as October 12th, 2023, I was on the radar of my administration in a way that I had never been before, for making quote unquote Jewish students feel unsafe. And, we can go into how, feelings are not facts, and there is the feeling of unsafety, and then there's actually the real violence and unsafety that Palestinians in Gaza are living through every day, Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and the diaspora, Arab Muslim students, faculty, and staff in the United States. But that was sort of the narrative. And so for a few months over the course of the fall semester, I was informally investigated for my teaching, for my writing. There were all of these pesky academic freedom protections that were getting in the way. And then at the very beginning of spring 2024, a week after the Department of Education came out with its list of 100 schools that were under investigation for violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act or anti-Semitism, my college, Muhlenberg, was one of them. I found out that I was under investigation and being placed on leave for a single Instagram story. And, so many of us are seeing the way that our social media is being surveilled and used, from everything from being placed on leave like I was, to Palestinian Arab Muslim grad students and faculty who are actually being detained and, disappeared by ICE and turned into political prisoners. So in the grand scheme of things, my situation was really quite mild. But what I later learned through the investigation was that Hillel staff members on my college campus had been surveilling my social media, taking screenshots of things I was posting, sending them to students in Hillel leadership in a WhatsApp group chat, and encouraging them to file equal opportunity violations. So one of the things that we've been seeing a lot over the past year and a half is how Zionists use lawfare. So the way that they're actually using things like the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, not just to, like, within the law, try to silence pro-Palestine speech, but actually weaponize the law in order to criminalize this speech. And so that is something that I think my case reveals in action. We're seeing this, much more clearly now, but essentially I was investigated on the grounds that the student argued that Zionism and Judaism are the same. And my college took the word of that student, and therefore I violated the equal opportunity non-discrimination policy. And I was fired essentially for anti-Semitism because of anti-Zionist speech. And I went through 2 appeals processes. AAUP investigated my college. It's very clear from all of the reporting that there was absolutely no actual violation. But I do think it's important to note that in addition to the way that lawfare is being utilized by Zionists, there's also the crisis of higher ed. And so the fear that donors were making threats that if I was not fired, they would stop funding the college, I think was enough for my college administration to say, we would rather alienate faculty and destroy academic freedom than lose our donors. And so I was fired in May of 2024, and I formally resigned in March of 2025.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for that breakdown, and that, covers a lot. I mean, the main thing, it seems, right, is the conflation of, anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which of course is not unique to this university, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or sorry, college. It's Congress, right, passed a resolution, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and so I think that that seems to illustrate a real problem, right, in this whole discourse. What do you do when people don't agree on the definition of Zionism, or people are deliberately confusing the definition of Zionism? There was, I don't know if you saw Ezra Klein's most recent column in the New York Times.
Try to avoid the New York Times and
Sure.
Ezra Klein, so catch me up.
Well, so I will say, a family member emailed me that article. I won't say which is fine. I'm actually, glad, because I do want to, keep up with certain things.
No, I'm
the
being
mainstream.
a little tongue in cheek. Yeah.
I get it. And it's, well, so, okay, let me just ask you this, and then maybe we can kind of dig into what Zionism really is, because he quoted the historian Deborah Lipstadt, and she's a historian of the Holocaust and Jewish history, and basically she her point was that opposition to Zionism, whether it's well-intentioned or not, because, of course, a lot of, in particular, younger Jews now are starting to move away from Zionism, or at least some, she said that even if it's well-intentioned, the impact is anti-Semitic, and she defines Zionism as the right of Jews to have a national homeland. Now, I understand it was just a quote in a news article, and maybe she expanded on the definition, but that was the definition given. What do you think about that definition? Do you think it is incomplete? Do you think it's problematic? Do you think, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's incomplete and problematic, and also, telling on itself, as, so many Zionist talking points do. So, if we were to take that definition in good faith, I think that it's a little disingenuous to think that asserting that Jewish people have the right to a national homeland. Nobody has the right to a theocratic ethno-state. Nobody does. And especially when that, theocratic ethno-state is built on stolen land through apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing. Nobody has that right. And I think the sort of flippant, Zionism is Judaism and Jews have the right to X, Y, and Z sort of tries to pave over what those words actually mean. And so when I hear liberal Zionists try to defend Zionism through some like cultural or spiritual connection to the land or a need for a safe homeland, it just feels so historically inaccurate, because the sort of argument there is this very sort of like loose play with history that suggests that in the wake of the Holocaust, and this is explicitly said often, that in the wake of the Holocaust, Jews need a homeland in order to feel safe. And of course, those of us who are actually studying Zionism know that Zionism is much older than World War II. And as a political project, it emerges at the end of the 19th century as an explicitly Jewish supremacist settler colonial project. If we read the early Zionists, especially Theodor Herzl, what he's saying is the problem with Europe is that Jews are cast out of white supremacy and the nation state, but we want those things. So we can get them by changing the frame, by transforming white supremacy into Jewish supremacy and colonizing Palestine. He writes to all sorts of anti-Semitic national leaders all over Europe, as well as Cecil Rhodes, and is like, I have this great plan for colonization. And you can't go and steal somebody's land, ethnically cleanse them, murder, hundreds of thousands of people, and create an apartheid state at the sort of foundation of this project, and then claim that it's the right for self-determination or it's the right to have a homeland. We who study history know that there were Jews in Palestine for a very long time. And, the transformation from a certain kind of coexistence beyond the frame of the nation and ethnic and religious identity, and then a theocratic ethno-state that is actively an apartheid system that is in and out of active genocide for 77 years, isn't something that is about having like a cultural affinity to the land or a desire to be safe. And so I think that there's nothing redeemable about Zionism, and there's nothing redeemable about Israel. And the important work here is to constantly be calling that out and reminding people that even if you don't want your political project to be rooted in settler colonial genocide, that doesn't stop your political project from being rooted in settler colonial genocide. And the evidence, regardless of what we say and regardless of what our words mean, the evidence is in what we're seeing in Gaza right now, which is the first live stream genocide, the most horrific things that are being done to Palestinians every day by Israel through the argument of self-defense and national security, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're seeing the inevitable conclusion of Zionism playing out right now.
Right. And we seem to be in the darkest of dark times with this genocide, as Palestinians are collapsing in the streets from starvation. So yeah, well, thank you for all of that breakdown. I mean, there's so much to think about there. Well, let's get to specifically, because I think you're sort of touching upon some of the ideas that you discuss in your recent Mondo Weiss article, which in which you point out that basically ideas of Jewish supremacy have been central to the Zionist movement from the beginning, and you say that we need to call that out, just as we call out white supremacy in the United States. Can you just talk a little bit about that specific argument. I mean, now you were sort of talking about it already, but if
Yeah.
you specifically on, on that idea, because, to your point, right, that I guess, as you said, the white supremacy was not accessible to the European Zionists, so they left, and one of the things Herzl said, right, was that their nation state that they set up would be an outpost of civilization against barbarism, and of course, we know the implication of that. But yeah, if you could just elaborate on some of the ideas in that article about.
Yeah. And I realized that I steamrolled over your question. So to sort of push into that a little bit more. And, one thing that I do. And right. One thing that I would also say about Zionism and, just being a project of Zionists arguing that it's really just a project of Jewish self-determination, I feel like is the same as, white supremacists being like, it's just about being proud of being white. And, you can say that, but that's not actually true. But I think the thing about actively and specifically referring to Zionism as Jewish supremacy feels really important to me, because I feel like Zionism, which, the United States is a very Zionist country in addition to being a white supremacist country. And those things exist at the same time, even if they seem contradictory. It's about power. It's about certain kinds of racialized hierarchies. It's about who gets to be who has access to full personhood and who doesn't. And we see that in this country. We see in the United States, the United States is also a settler colonial nation. The way that this country is structured, with a history of racial capitalism and extraction and land theft and enslaved labor and capitalism, we've created this structure in which nothing here works without inequality, and we have no socialist history, and we have no imagination outside of capitalism. And I think we see, and so, from my perspective, we need to upend empire everywhere. And I would say, what I was trying to get at in this article is that the same needs to be said about Israel as an occupying and, an occupying force. So there are all of these liberal arguments about a two-state solution and about coexistence and about Israel that has much more inclusive, a sense of belonging. And yet this is a structure that by design is hierarchical. It's an apartheid system. There's a hierarchy of belonging, a hierarchy of citizenship. And so when I'm talking about Jewish supremacy, I'm talking about a country where the only way to access full citizenship, both legally and, in a much more cultural, social, and symbolic way, is to be a white Ashkenazi European descendant Jewish person. That is the only way to receive full citizenship and belonging. And then the hierarchy sort of descends from there until you get Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, you get Palestinians in occupied Jerusalem, you have Palestinians in occupied Gaza, and in between you have Jews who are not coded as white, you have Arab Jews, you have, the in descending order. And so to say white supremacy, Zionism is white supremacy, I think would lose the fact that this is actually about white Jews being at the top by design. That was Herzl's vision. That was how he was able to get so many Jewish communities to move to occupied Palestine. It was through accessing whiteness that they couldn't before accessing, land in ways that they couldn't before. And so in the way that within our structure, our violent hierarchical structure in the United States, we don't have a path forward to true equality without some kind of structural collapse and revolution. I would say the same is true in Israel. There's no possibility for Israel to continue to exist in a way that is not Jewish supremacist. And so I want to very much think the United States and Israel as partners and also as structures that mimic each other with very different histories alongside each other without using the same frame to describe two different histories, if that makes sense. So I think that's why Jewish supremacy is so important as an analytic for me.
Yeah, I mean that is very interesting, and I think that I like that you break it down as a structure, right? Because I think that some people just hear, oh, Zionism is Jewish supremacy, and then if someone identifies as a Zionist, you're saying, okay, well, you calling me a racist, and it's like it's not so much like about just how you feel, right? It's about the actual structure that has to exist in order to preserve it. I mean, so I think that that's really important. I mean, there's so much that to unpack there again, from what you said. But and your Uncle Norman has said that he actually has stopped or is going to stop using the word Zionist and use the term Jewish supremacist instead. Of course, that that seems very very much in line with many of the things that he's talked about over time. But regardless of what we call it, you're identifying obviously in important structural issues there. So this raises a lot of interesting questions, because on the one hand, and I'm forgive me for probably butchering what you've said in my attempt to paraphrase, but I mean you're talking about in part kind of the allure for white Ashkenazi Jews to this to this project because of that hierarchical structure. What about I mean the I guess when I think about what we would call liberal Zionism today, because the early Zionists and Israel's founders were somewhat open about the fact, or not somewhat, but were very open about the fact that this was a settler colonial project, that this was this project essentially of admitting we have to go there, we have to take their land. It seemed like that was not an easy sell to the wider Jewish public, right? Like most people, most Jewish people would not just sort of like jump at the idea of that kind of imperial project. And so I'm curious to know maybe just about your upbringing and kind of how Zionism was presented to you or in the circles that you were in, because I know you've talked about how you always sort of, felt uncomfortable around Zionism. Even it sounds like even at an early age, even before you knew a lot about Israel, Palestine, and the history. So, how was Zionism? I guess quote unquote sold. I mean, was it the sort of land without a people narrative, where there was just an erasure of Palestinian existence? Was it the more the occupation is just an unfortunate reality, but it's necessary for security? What types of narratives were you given?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, in part, I'll say sometimes I struggle to remember this because I was so, keeping this at arm's length. But I had two parallel experiences. One is that I went to a public high school right outside of Washington, D.C., and had a very diverse group of friends, none of whom were Jewish. And then the other is that I was still from, kindergarten or nursery school through 10th grade, getting a Jewish education at my synagogue. I was bat mitzvahed. I was confirmed. I was, in middle school and high school attending this education twice a week, where Zionism was very central. I mean, I was growing up in the 90s, and I would, enter my synagogue in Washington, D.C., and there would be Israeli flags. We stand with Israel. It was just sort of ubiquitous. And I remember my Hebrew teacher was a former Israeli soldier. I did not like her. I don't know what to do about that, but I do remember that she taught us how to swear, and everybody thought that was very cool. But there was this sort of underlying collapse of Judaism and Israel, and really like work to conflate the two, to the point in which I've said elsewhere that growing up, it felt as though God had been replaced by Israel. And I was just like a difficult kid. Like I was very contrarian. I liked to be alone. I wasn't really like part of a pack mentality. I think that this was probably because I was queer. I felt like an outsider. I was always looking for ways to resist mainstream. I was a vegetarian. I became a vegan. I would go to protests. I was trying to get arrested. And nationalism just did not sit well with me. I didn't stand at the Pledge of Allegiance in elementary school. And so I think I was sort of primed to go to my synagogue for my Jewish education and be like, well, if I don't like one kind of nationalism, why would I want two forms of nationalism? And I really had that be the sort of basis of how I understood my disavowal and eventual in high school discovery of Palestine and Palestinians that had been completely erased from my education through reading Edward Said, and then the doors opened. But I had this really wild, I haven't even processed this yet, but I had this really wild experience yesterday where I met up with a dear friend who I went to high school with. We drifted apart. We reconnected maybe 5 years ago, and we were having a drink, and she's not Jewish. And she was recounting how so many of the Jewish boys and then men who we grew up with were Jewish supremacists, that they were, she's Black. And so they were bringing this sort of like racism and Jewish supremacy to their interactions with her and being like, well, that we're God's chosen people, that Israel is the best, Israel is ours, all of this stuff. I have no memory of this because I was so disconnected. But it was interesting to hear her tell the story of even these teenage boys were embracing this notion of Jewish supremacy and, being God's chosen people. And that just seemed, I didn't realize that even in our public high school, that was sort of everywhere. It was infusing the air. It was how they were bullying people. It was how they were sort of, talking about their own superiority. And I think that, who wants to buy into one's own group's superiority within a perceived hierarchy of humanity? I mean, that's a pretty pathological way of being that, my parents did not raise me to believe, but my parents were not Zionists. So one of the things, I'm sort of not articulating this well, but I think, it was so beyond my comprehension to sort of see myself in this. And, I'm white. I was, socialized into whiteness. I'm not going to pretend like I'm not constantly unlearning white supremacy and Jewish supremacy, to be honest. But I think that like active embracing of we are superior. We are entitled to this land. It doesn't matter if anybody was there. That really, I realized last night, was really baked into what it was like to be raised within a Jewish community in the 90s as this, financial and political relationship with Israel was really being sedimented in Jewish communities to the point in which they couldn't be separated. So I think I have a lot to think about with that. But I think the argument that I want to make is that I think this notion of Jewish supremacy and therefore connection to Israel was really being taught both at my synagogue and in religious education. And also, I imagine, at home by a lot of, more elite Jewish families in the 90s. That doesn't make sense to me. And I think we're seeing that sort of play out right now with people who are still holding on to Israel's quote unquote right to defend itself and this this hysteria over anti-Semitism while we're watching the most horrible things that people could do to another people being done to Palestinians by Israel, funded by the United States every day.
Right. I mean, that's definitely a difficult thing to argue at this time. But so that raises a lot of, again, interesting questions. No,
my half-baked ideas.
No, well, okay. Well, I would say no, they're definitely more than half-baked. But you've said that it is the job of Jews to dismantle Zionism. And of course, there are, I mean, Jewish Voice for Peace being one of the most prominent anti-Zionist Jewish organizations. There are certainly organizations working to, you know, move Jews away from Zionism and, work towards Palestinian liberation. Given that, Zionism is such a large part of so many Jewish people's upbringing, given that, it has been so effectively tied to Jewish identity, I guess, I don't know, it's a difficult question to frame, but I guess I'll just fumble through the frame. I mean, has it in some sense, has Zionism become a part of Jewish identity, or a in practice, a kind of denomination of Judaism, and in order to dismantle Zionism, as you said, does that require working with people who are still tied to Zionism, or what are your thoughts on that matter? Because I know, obviously this was, quite a while ago now, but I know what happened at Muhlenberg involved some social media posts which were not conciliatory at all with the Zionists, right? So what are your thoughts now? Do you think that we should be thinking about ways to actually try to help Zionists move away from that, particularly given that it seems that there are a number who are at least grappling with it, given the current genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, I'll work backwards. I think that if 21 months into a live stream genocide in which we have all seen what I would argue is close to 1 million people be slaughtered, starved, denied water and medical care, torn apart, and tortured in ways that I am losing the ability to comprehend, let alone find language to. If 21 months into watching that, you're grappling with your relationship to Zionism, then I do not think that there is hope for you. I just really I think that, I spent the first few months of the genocide and even the first year trying, holding space for some people in my life who hadn't really gotten it before. And, this is not because we weren't in conversation or whatever, but we're really oh God, how do I sort of break up with my fantasy of Zionism in Israel because this is happening? And I think the ability to see what is happening and say, oh my God, maybe I was wrong, and address that wrongness, even if, I think it's because you bought into a supremacy mindset. That, I think I tried to hold some patience for certain people in my life. I think we've so passed that point of no return that if at this point you think that there's anything redeemable about Israel and Zionism, I don't want to know you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And this is where I think that the post that I reposted by Rami Kanazi is more relevant than it ever was. Shame Zionists. Don't let them feel safe in your spaces. Why should these genocide-loving fascists be treated any differently than any other racist? I think that this is the same question of, do you want to help members of the KKK feel better about, Black people? Do you want to, help the Proud Boys feel better about queer people? Do you want to help Nazis feel better about Jewish people? I think that if you are willing to buy into these ideologies, given everything, and I think that the genocide in Gaza is worse than all of those examples because we're actually literally seeing it happen every day. Nobody can say that they didn't know unless you are literally living off the grid in a hole so far from the internet that you've been able to like stay offline for the past 21 months. Everybody else knows exactly what's happening and are choosing not to acknowledge there's a genocide. I mean, Bret Stephens, that fucking guy, Bret Stephens, and the fucking New York Times, since I was told I was allowed to curse, had an article yesterday that was denying that this is a genocide. You know, I have in the past, I consented to an interview with the New York Times Magazine for complicated reasons. But at this point, I feel like, Mona Chalabi has said this more articulately than I did on Real Talk Middle East. Podcast, but like we should be boycotting all of these information spaces that are, providing cover for Zionists who are arguing that this is not a genocide. Anyone 21 months into this who have not quite figured out whether or not they want to acknowledge the humanity of Palestinians, the violence of Zionism and Israel and the United States, and the reality of a genocide, there's no hope for them. I mean, perhaps in the future they'll say they didn't know or they always knew, but they were scared or whatever. But I think we all know who stands where. Sorry, this is like my very like worked up. I have no interest in, I'm not a teacher anymore. I'm not in the classroom. I do not have the responsibility to spend, 16 weeks helping my students think about complicated things. That used to be my job. But now my job is to say, if you do not acknowledge that this is a genocide, if you do not acknowledge that Zionism and Israel should not exist, should be abolished, should be destroyed, and if you do not believe that Palestinians have the right not just to self-determination, but to literally live, then I do not acknowledge you. I do not want to have anything to do with you, and I will never, ever, ever forgive you. I think I forgot the rest of your question, but I do not think that there is anything redeemable for anyone who has not changed their mind over the past 21 months. The time has passed.
Sorry. I forgot the rest of my question too, but while I'm remembering it, I want to say a couple things. Actually, so per your teaching, I did want to commend you on one thing that I read, in the wake of October 7th, how you had told your students to email you any questions they had about the subject, and then you could answer them in class. And I thought that was maybe that seems very obvious and rudimentary to you, but I think that's such a great way of really eliciting honest questions and making the students still feel safe and expressing or inquiring about certain things. So, in terms of these mainstream media outlets that are complicit, Rashid Khalidi said something months ago on Katie Halper's show about how, not that these outlets would do that, but he was saying like they should be saying every night or, in every article that they're reporting on Gaza that we are not able to give you the full story because of, censorship guidelines or because of, the way that our editorial board essentially makes us frame things. He basically said that they should be admitting that they are lying or not able to tell us everything. Because, it's like we get stories about how, the New York Times says, you can't use these particular words, right? Or, everything has to go, right? Everything in the Jerusalem Bureau, right, has to go through the IDF censor anyway, right? Mm-hmm. A lot going on there. Now, it's interesting you brought up Bret Stephens, because I was actually just wondering the other day, I'm like, I haven't read anything from Bret Stephens about this in a while. I think the last thing that I read actually was when he was tarring Jonathan Glazer for his Oscar speech and saying that, he's a film director. He has no place like talking about politics. He just keep to what he knows. And of course, my thought was like, okay, if Jonathan Glazer had gotten up and said, "I stand with Israel," would you be saying that? No, of course not. You would be, praising him for his, loyalty. And I was very impressed with Glazer's willingness to say anything, in that speech at that time, because that was really only, maybe 5-6 months into, which of course, is a very long time, but it was at a point when still many people were afraid to talk.
Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people.
But back to, I think you did answer my question. I mean, it was basically, yes, it was about Jewish responsibility, towards Zionism and dismantling it. And to what extent does that involve trying to, quote unquote, convert Zionists away from that? Yeah.
And can I just sort of, I don't know if this is exactly answering that part of the question, but something, I've changed my mind a lot over the past 21 months. I mean, I think that, foundationally, I believe that, Israel has no right to exist. It shouldn't exist. It's a rogue state that has been committing genocide for 77 years. Zionism is an ideology, should be abolished, and Palestine should be free. I mean, that I sort of started from there. I've changed my mind a lot over the past 21 months because I've had the benefit of reading and learning, and we live in this, incredible hellscape in which I can be following Palestinian journalists in Gaza and writers in Gaza and, Palestinian writers and thinkers and academics all over the world who are helping me think better. And I've been incredibly grateful for that. And I've learned a lot from them to change the way that I speak about what it means to be Jewish right now. Because I think at the beginning of the genocide, I tried to draw on my Jewish identity in order to, provide cover, but also make arguments for Palestinian liberation and the end of Israel. I drew on Jewish values to say it's, genocide is not a Jewish value. And I was reminded by many people that that is actually a form of Jewish supremacy. The idea that I, as a Jewish person, are better equipped or well positioned or morally superior in any way to say things X, Y, and Z. And I've changed my mind. I think that it is the responsibility of Jewish people to do absolutely everything they can to make this genocide stop, to change policy, to condemn Zionism, to support Palestinian liberation, both because that is the foundation, as like the ground floor of basic human dignity, or decency. And also because this is all being done under, our name and because of anti-Semitism, which, doesn't even mean anything anymore. But that does not mean that Jews are better positioned or particularly positioned or, whatever to do this work. It is simply the obligation of being a person right now. And also, I talk to a lot of people who are like, I'm scared to speak up. I'm scared to speak up. And, sometimes I can hold space for that, but I cannot hold space for Jewish people who are afraid to speak up right now because we actually have a moral obligation because we are being used to justify the most horrific thing that I have ever seen. I mean, I was texting with some friends in Gaza earlier today and I said this is the worst thing that I've ever seen. And the response was, well, this is the worst thing we've ever lived through. This is happening to us. You are just seeing it. And I was reminded that how we position ourselves is so critical, and removing ego and not always being right and being wrong and doing the work anyway and sucking it up and not expecting to be congratulated for basic human decency. That is our obligation right now. That is the work that we need to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great thoughts, and I appreciate that breakdown. That you have officially left me wondering what to ask next, because again, you've given such a kind of a robust range of things to talk about. It's okay, but I do appreciate you touching upon how your thinking has evolved, and I feel similarly in the sense that I'm constantly reevaluating what I think, what I know, what I need to learn about this, how I should approach it, how I should speak about it, or when and where. And so I guess, I don't want to get too far off track, but you raised the issue of the people who really want to speak out and are afraid to. And unfortunately, we still, I mean, nearly 2 years into this, we still exist in a climate where there are very real material consequences for people, who do speak up. And of course, what happens to them, is not going to be, I mean, as you've said about yourself, is nothing compared to what is happening to those in Gaza. But there are people who are just very afraid of the consequences of doing the right thing. What should they do? Or, how, where does one find community? Where does one find support? I mean, because, this is, just speaking to the larger issue of, resistance and activism and standing up against injustice, especially at a time, where this, we have arguably the most authoritarian president we've ever had, right? And I say that as someone who has much criticism to say as about the previous administration and many other administrations, but, how do we find, support, the safety net, sorry, it's a very big question, but I guess, any sort of thoughts about that, at least in your circles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really hard question in general. And I think it's a even harder question in the United States because depending on where you are, I think LA and the resistance against ICE really shows others in the US that this kind of no nonsense, no bullshit, collective resistance is actually possible in the United States. We see pockets of this. We saw it in 2015. We saw it, during COVID. We've seen these moments in which certain communities can think collectively and sort of shed this very individualist, sort of myopic way of, living in hyper-capitalist America, which is basically just the largest global weapons manufacturer and no longer a country. But I think, the thing that breaks my heart, makes me feel grief and depression and no hope, is that it's often hard to imagine people creating a robust, long-term, and powerful collective movement that understands that we are not going to fix this tomorrow or next year, that this is a long-term struggle, that people are going to lose things, that, without loss, there's no change, there's no transformation, that the status quo is not working for anyone. And so any clawing onto the status quo as though, the American dream can be realized. It's just, we're living in a falsehood and we're watching this country that is, built on stolen land through enslaved labor, revealing itself to be just as rotten as so many of us have said that it is. So from that perspective, I think, what would it mean for us to really think collectively and not just about our individual losses? And what would it mean for us to imagine a long-term movement that maybe nobody or just our children will live to see the culmination of, but that we can take care of each other? That, I think that there are a lot of reasons why 90% of my colleagues either kept their mouth shut or believed that I deserved what happened to me. I think a lot of it has to do with their own fears about their own vulnerabilities. And so, they either blamed me as an individual for disrupting things, or they kept their head down so nobody would look at them. But that's not going to keep them safe long term, because all of our institutions are crumbling around us. And, our administrators, our politicians are happy to sacrifice everything that could potentially maintain this country as less horrible in order to appease the Trump administration and Israel. And so I wonder, what are we holding on to? And what would it take to realize that we actually just have to start taking care of each other? And we have to figure out who can make sacrifices, who can experience loss, and who's going to take care of us when that happens? Because I don't think everybody should be doing the same thing. I think, if you're going to be deported or detained because you're here on a green card or a visa, if you say something, if you make yourself public, I mean, I think people need to take care of themselves. But I also think that there are people who are less vulnerable and can, be more visible. And then there's work that is happening behind the scenes. There's work that's like chipping away at the violence of our institutions. There's, folks whose superpowers are pushing against bureaucracy. There's so many different ways that we can be engaged in a movement, but we need to really think about it collectively, and we need to really be thinking about it as a long-term investment in building, we can call it the left, we can call it an actual progressive movement, we can call it socialism, whatever, but something that is going to actually sustain us over what I think is going to be a very long and potentially very violent struggle. And I think the biggest thing is that we live in the United States and nobody wants to lose anything. It's all about accumulation. And the truth is we're going to have to start losing things. And, in some ways I've gotten a lot of attention for losing my job. And within American capitalism, that really sucks because I needed my health insurance and I needed my income, but it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It's probably not the worst thing that will ever happen to me. It is a thing that happened to me, but there's so many more vulnerabilities that we have to be thinking about. And I see so many folks who do not want to lose their shitty jobs because they cannot imagine how they will be okay otherwise. And that, I think, is a problem with collective imagination and the way that we can show up and care for each other in this struggle. So I guess I'm just saying, I think we need to be very un-American in the way that we dismantle American empire and work towards a better future. And I think that that's about imagining what community care and long-term struggle can be. And none of our roadmaps, or most of our roadmaps, are not in this country. They're elsewhere. They're, in Turkey, they're in Latin America, they're in India, they're in, Russia. Where are these movements happening? How can we think strategically about how we move forward? Because I think I hear people talk about how they're scared to lose their job. These things make sense, but in 20 years, how do you want to remember who you were in this moment? Did you lose a job that wasn't even all that great? And because you actually believed in something, or were you too afraid of, what that could mean? And again, I'm saying this, I know that everybody has different vulnerabilities, but I think we just need to imagine beyond ourselves, because there is no version of this future within the American status quo that is good for anyone aside from a handful of billionaires.
Yeah. And as such a great point, I mean, the sort of dehumanization of, many people working jobs that they don't like, where they don't feel valued, but still being terrified of losing them, among other things. But well, then, so, okay, since you touched upon billionaires in this, essentially, yes, being a situation that only benefits them, if I would love to chat briefly. I know we're close to the end of the hour here, but I'd love to talk a little bit about, since we're both New Yorkers here, the New York City mayoral race, and the apparent rise of Zoran Mamdani, or at least the primary success. He does. I mean, am I correct in saying that he appears to be an anti-Zionist, or at least, he believes that, Israel should exist as a state with equal rights, right? Which implies not a hierarchical structure that we've been talking about. So, yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, both on that issue and just, on the fact that he seems to be, a genuine socialist candidate who people are responding to.
I have so much to say about this, and I'll see if I can keep it brief.
Take your time.
I've really going on some soapbox today.
We can go as long as you want. I just want to respect your time. So,
well, I will say, as a former student of Mahmoud Mamdani and a fan of Miraner, I'm very it doesn't surprise me that Zoran is the child of an anti-colonial academic and an artist. That makes sense to me. I was like recently introduced to the Mr. Cardamom music video, which I think is totally delightful. So I'll start with that. I think that we should never pin our hopes on electoral politics in the United States because it is a completely broken system and revolutionary change is not possible through the political machine monster that we have. And I do not think that, Zoran is going to save us. And I don't think that we should expect that. I also think that you cannot enter into New York politics and hope to hold on to the purity of your politics. So I believe that Zoran supports Palestinian liberation. And I think that when you say, I think that Israel should be like a democratic, inclusive country, that is code for it never will be. So maybe it shouldn't exist. But I think we're already seeing the way that he is required to make compromises in his speech in order to not alienate certain people. And I think that will happen in policy when hopefully he's elected in November. But I was having this conversation with some friends and my partner the other day. And so I'm just sort of parroting other people's ideas and a little bit of my own. But I do think that there's something really inspiring about seeing a politician who is for better, for worse in the Democratic Party, but is, a democratic socialist and seems to have like very strong socialist values, actually not being like a Barack Obama who's like hope. And hope is, we're vibes. Like this was like even pre Kamala Harris, where it's like everything is vibes, but actually saying hope looks like being part of a community, connecting with people above 125th Street, having real policies for, the 34th Street corridor, having real ideas about how to help small business owners. Like, don't come talk to me about hope. Show me policy. And I think it's incredibly inspiring. And I wish that the Democrats, I wish we had more than a two-party system, but I wish the Democrats would get their heads out of their asses and look at him and realize that this is actually what hope looks like. It's not vibes. It's not a slogan. It's actually real policies that would be pretty easy to implement, despite, Eric Adams deciding not to do all of these things. So I say this to say, electoral politics will never save us and they will never bring liberation and revolution and transformation. But the idea of having someone in the mayoral race who has a chance of winning, who is actually invested in pushing forward and through policy that will help this city, this community, I think is really incredible. I think, the way that he has positioned himself, the way that he, understands how to like walk up and down New York, connect with people, see his constituents, take them seriously, listen to them. That should be like the foundation of politics, but we know because of how the United States works that it's not. And I'm willing to be invigorated by that after the multiple disappointments that quote unquote progressive candidates, who break our heart. If we get too excited, I think he'll break my heart. And I also think that if he gets elected, he will do real important things. I think both of those things are true. And I think that we need to support him and vote for him if we're New York voters, and also not expect that he's going to save us, because this is not how we get free. We don't get free through electoral politics. We get through community organizing and liberation work and revolution. And that's, voting is not it.
Yeah, those are such important lessons. And I agree with everything you're saying. And I think the big question is, how to approach. So say he is elected and he breaks breaks our hearts in some way, whether because of his own choices or whether just he's unable to do certain things. How this is maybe somewhat of a substanceless question, but I think it's, I'm going to ask anyway. It's like, how do you remind people, to maintain a certain, adversarial relationship with power, even when the person that we want is in power? And I don't necessarily mean being adversarial towards, Zoran himself, but I mean being skeptical of, the office that he occupies, because I think that it's just, you see it every election cycle, not just, municipal elections. I mean, federal elections, where people might get really excited about a candidate, right? And then they'll give that person a pass, no matter what they do once they're in office. So do we just have to remind people? Do we have to be the annoying person in the room who's always saying, like,
Yeah.
don't get too cozy?
I mean, I think accountability is a form of care. And I think, whether you want to say it's calling people out, calling people in, organizing, drawing attention to, violence and structural problems, et cetera, that is our responsibility. We're not supposed to be creating these, fantasy effigies out of our politicians and like placing them on a pedestal and hoping that they, I think that, a lot of folks did that with Obama. I think a lot of people did that with AOC. We're seeing exactly where that gets us. And, the way that AOC is just so defensive and condescending and horrible when she's called out on her hypocrisy, I think is a lesson on why, we were never supposed to have career politicians. You serve your constituents in the way that you can, and then you move on when you can't do that anymore. And so I think, it's really important to continue to hold people like Zoran accountable to the community that they both claim and actively represent. This is not about ego. This is not about, our need to like make him feel good. And I think this is going to be really complicated because he's also going to be contending with completely baseless Islamophobic and racist attacks from the right, the center, and so I think figuring out how to be like very clear about the difference. Like we should always be skeptical of people in power, and we should always be holding those in power accountable, especially when their job is to represent us. And to not do so is completely cynical. And, I do not know him, so I don't know how, he would feel about what I'm saying, but I would hope that he wants to be held accountable to his constituents because his whole platform is on being accountable to his constituents. I mean, that's what he's been saying over and over. So let's do what he asks.
Well, I'm sure if he sees this, he'll make a very funny short video kind of in response.
I hope so.
Suggests that he will indeed be held accountable and gladly, for it, and be careful about using the word ultimately too much. I think that was the one, right, that he got called out for. So, I mean, I think anyone who is that, attentive to his grammar and usage, I think that's a good sign. So one other thing I want to ask, I mean, if I can just come back to this briefly, is, academia. Do you now where you're at, has the whole experience soured you on, pursuing a full-time, either tenure or non-tenure track position? Do you just, do you want to do something else entirely? Do you have any thoughts about the future of academic quote unquote freedom such that it exists? I don't know what my future will be after, doing podcast episodes like this, but it's
that's
something to keep in mind. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but listen, if there's any hiring committees out there who want a tenured anthropologist who can't keep her mouth shut and will, talk about the things that I think are most important because that's fundamental to my training and my discipline and the work that I do, give me a call. I'm happy to come back. I love teaching, and I think that there's a lot of really important work that higher ed has in the past. I mean, higher ed, does academic freedom exist? I don't think it's ever truly existed. I think that our institutions are wildly hierarchical, white supremacist, and, very, very, very violent. But I also found a lot of satisfaction being able to do the work that I could in the classroom and with my students. And I miss teaching and I miss mentoring. And I think that I was really good at that. And I had really great relationships with my students. I don't think, even before this happened, there were no jobs in higher ed. No, I was an adjunct and a VAP for, years before I got my tenure track job. And, as it's anywhere between 70 to 80% of academic faculty are not on the tenure track and don't have access to tenure. And if you're, a person of color, especially if you're a woman of color, you're probably going to get denied tenure the first time, if not the second time. I mean, our institutions are just so broken, and probably foundationally so. But so, yeah, I would take a job, but I don't think that anybody's going to hire me. But I will say that the direction that we are going in higher ed, and have been for a really long time, in terms of funding models, in terms of cutting faculty, cutting departments, like student debt, raising prices, bloating the administration, putting all of our budgets into our college president's salary, and, our provosts, everything is broken in higher ed. And I do not think that there's a Band-Aid. I do not think that there's a quick fix. What we need is robust, public funded education. And we haven't had that in this country in a really, really long time. So I worked at a private college. I don't want to work at a private college. I don't want to teach students who are so stressed out about the fact that they're going to graduate with like $150,000 to $200,000 worth of debt, and they're never going to get jobs, and they don't know what to do. And, they're just spinning out all of the time, which was my experience a lot of the time in the classroom and in my office. And so I don't think that there's a model of American higher ed, especially after the past 2 years, that I want anything to do with, to be honest. But I am invested in being part of a movement that is trying to completely transform the way that we can think about learning, the way we can think about education, study, research. We need academics, we need intellectuals. They do not have to be in higher ed. I think we're a very anti-intellectual country. We always have been. And so, I think that when we see the landscape of the United States and everything that is happening, the idea of like fixing higher ed is kind of impossible, because it's an institution that's embedded in this much larger landscape that, as it exists, I cannot imagine a way through. So that is a long way of saying I'm going to continue to teach in the ways that I can, and continue to do research and write in the ways that I can. And I no longer believe that there is a place for me in American higher ed. And I would love to see myself proved wrong, or to see that change. And I'm invested in being part of the movement that works to change that. But we have a long ways to go.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly put the word out to any academic hiring committees, as well as any publishing houses who either want to see your manuscript or just offer you an upfront book deal to write about something.
I take it.
Anything else? Any other jobs that you want to apply for right now, just while we're talking?
The funny thing is, I'm 45, and for the first time in my life, I'm like, I just don't want a job. Can we just destroy capitalism and collectively, figure out ways to take care of each other? And, I'm going to need a job, because, I'm a freelance editor right now. If you need editing, let me know, anybody. But I think we have a terrible model of labor, and it really, who wants a job? Or, we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Happy, and living in like a liberated, utopia in which we're not like, we can't eat and we can't pay rent, but we can fund a genocide. Who wants to live in that world? Anyway, that's my soapbox. I don't actually want a job. I know I need a job. Sure. I will get a job someday, maybe. But as the economy continues to collapse.
Yeah, but it's true. It's like when you ask kids what they want to be, and usually, if they might not be thinking about occupations, or if they are, it usually has something tied to their values, right? It's not like, I just want to be head of marketing at this company. And I mean, no shade to marketing. I mean, I know that, that has a necessity as well. But okay. Since I think we've successfully, or at least partially, diagnosed the problem with our country. So, what I would like to do now, for the purposes of this show, is draft out a little resistance roadmap. Per Maura Finkelstein. So yeah, what, and you've kind of alluded to some things as we've been talking, but are there specific steps that you would recommend people to take? And I know that I gave you a few categories. You're welcome to either use those or just to, create your own.
Yeah. I mean, I loved your list of categories, and I'm not like a categorical thinker. So I'll start with what I think. Yeah, of course. And so I'll start with what I think is most important right now. I think, we need to be investing in ways of caring for each other, ourselves and each other, that are beyond our very limited scope of what community is. And so, everybody would answer this question differently, obviously. So I don't want to say the most important thing that we can be doing right now. But for me, the most important thing that I'm doing right now is being involved in advocating for raising money and contributing to mutual aid campaigns in Gaza. And so for me personally, there's two models. There's the one that I support, which is the Samir Project. I'm just going to shout them out as much as I can. Please donate to the Samir Project. They are, I think, one of the most transparent organizations. If you're donating, if you're contributing to NGOs, please stop doing that and contribute to mutual aid organizations like the Samir Project. They're actually getting food and water and fuel and medical care and evacuations and all kinds of things for folks in Gaza. And things are so bad right now. Their donations are lower than they've ever been, I believe. And everything is more expensive than it's ever been, if you can get anything at all. So the sort of desperation that these campaigns are experiencing, there's no words for it. So if you have any money, please donate to the Samir Project. If you, if you're in New York on Saturday, I'm, co-organizing a fundraiser at Brooklyn Poets. Come by. I don't know if this will be out yet, but it will already have happened. But there's ways that we can just be if you don't have the funds, you can be highlighting them. You can, organize fundraisers. You can, repost their posts on social media. And so I like the idea of the Samir Project because they're targeting the most vulnerable communities, and they're paying and supporting Palestinians on the ground in Gaza who are risking their lives to provide resources to the most vulnerable communities. On the flip of that, and I think this is also really important, there are individuals and families in Gaza who either on their own or with family and friends outside of Gaza have their own individual or family mutual aid campaigns. And I think those are also really important. You can connect with folks, you can sponsor their campaigns, you can help them raise money. Everybody is really desperate. There's there are journalists in Gaza who are on hunger strikes right now. They're being starved by Israel during an ongoing genocide, and they're on hunger strikes to draw attention to the fact that there's such an uneven distribution of resources and aid is being blocked. And so everybody is starving. Most people are dealing with unimaginable medical crises because all of the hospitals have been destroyed. Israel is blocking doctors and materials from coming in. The situation, I could go on, but for me, I write and I scream into the void and I post on social media, and I will continue to do all of those things. And I just don't, and I'm doing that because to stop doing that feels like defeat, but I just no longer feel like what we need is information. You have the information. If you choose to ignore this, if you choose to deny this, you're a horrible person. And I hope that you never find a moment of peace the rest of your life. And the thing that actually feels the most meaningful right now is to be organizing and supporting initiatives to keep people alive. And it's really hard. And if you're getting involved, you probably will make a lot of mistakes. I make a lot of mistakes all the time. And I think we just need to do this work. We need to put our ego aside, realize that we're not always going to get it right, and do absolutely everything we can to support communities who are being annihilated every day. I mean, hundreds of people are being killed every day trying to get aid. So that's the thing that is just feeling the most important to me on an individual and community level, because we can do this as individuals. We also can organize with people in our communities to have a much bigger reach in terms of promoting these campaigns. There's an organization called Workshops for Gaza. When you take their workshops or teach for their workshops, all of the money raised goes to the Samir Project. You can buy books through Open Books, which all the proceeds go to the Samir Project. There are just all of these ways for us to rethink how we are in relation to capital and try to get as much money into Gaza as we possibly can, while also grappling with the fact that our tax dollars are funding the annihilation of Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, it's a real mindfuck. Yeah. So that's what's feeling most important to me right now.
Okay, those are all terrific steps, and I did put the Saturday fundraiser in my calendar, and I also put it in one of my activist chats, and I'll remind them, and hopefully, we can get a few people there on
That'd be great.
Saturday.
I can send you the flyer. Yeah.
Yes, please do. I think this is all terrific. Terrific advice, and
I think, I have less faith in this, but I also think, call your representatives, write to your representatives, be as loud as you can. If I'm sort of grappling with what it means to go to protests right now, but I do think that there's something about like continuing to refuse the erasure and silencing that we're being forced to contend with, and just continue to be resisting the narrative and the pressure of exhaustion and fear. It's hot in New York, but I still try to wear a keffiyeh everywhere I go. I just think like there are just 100 different things that we can be doing every day, in addition to actually providing material support that like uses our bodies and our words and our thoughts to resist the silencing that our government and everyone in power, and probably like members of our community, are asserting upon us. I think we just have to keep resisting that, because as soon as they can silence us, they can control us, and we have to be ungovernable.
And I think that's a great point, because I think that many people in power thought by now, this would quiet down, right? That the protests would quiet down, that everything. But so I think that continuing to make noise or just be seen or, show any signs, I think they do make a difference. And there are always, people on the street who just respond to that when they see it. And it's, it's an important reminder that that this is not over, and that we still need to be doing things. Well, thank you so much. This was a terrific conversation. So I really appreciate you sharing your time today and your thoughts. Thank you so much for having me. Absolutely. And thank you everyone for tuning in to Right of Resistance. Please join us next time for more talk about propaganda, injustice, and ways to resist. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and consider supporting the show on Patreon. Right of Resistance is an independent podcast. We don't have corporate sponsors or media backers. We rely on listeners like you. So if you want to help us grow, visit patreon.com/rightofresistance to become a member for as little as $3 a month. Every contribution makes a difference.